I played some great video games this year. I want to talk about a bunch of them because they're good and you should check them out. That's the video. But seriously, in a year dominated by so much toxicity around several big releases, it would be easy to get the mistaken impression that video games are dying. To be fair, there has been a lot of studio closures and worker burnout that's been reported on, which is a serious problem that will never be solved without a complete restructuring of the entire games industry, so good luck with that. But looking just at the games themselves, we've been getting some absolutely amazing works of art. I wanted to close out this year with some positivity, highlighting several of the good to excellent games that I played because they deserve more love. I want to be clear about a couple of things before we start. The first is that these are games I played this year, not necessarily games that came out this year. Some are, some aren't. The other thing I want to clarify is that these are exclusively games I played for the first time. Obviously, I replayed Pillars of Eternity and Baldur's Gate 3 for my video about both of them, but I'd played both before. Lastly, there are some other games I played for the first time this year that I just didn't have any thoughts about I felt were worth sharing, like Cocoon, or Solstice, or Sins of a Solar Empire 2. So here are some games I played for the first time in 2024, but not necessarily that came out in 2024, and also games that I actually have things to say about. That was originally the title, but catchy brevity always outranks pure accuracy. Go figure. Strange to start with this, considering most of the others I want to talk about, but it was one of the first games I tried this year and serves as an interesting point of contrast with those I most value. I wouldn't normally have picked it up at all because it's in early access, and I don't play early access games, and it's also not my typical genre. However, one of my best friends really wanted to try it, so a group of buddies and I spent maybe a good couple weeks pal-worlding around while the game was the talk of the town. It's quite fun. I have very little respect for it. We have to remember that every multiplayer game is better with friends, but I do think Palworld is well designed from a gameplay perspective. Fighting enemies is simple but fun, the classic, ooh, a cool new monster to catch impulse that propelled Pokemon to the top of franchise success is strongly felt, and the world has enough cool parts to it to make exploring consistently fun. Then of course there's the base management, where you force the cute animals you capture to work unpaid labor in your military-industrial factories. This adds a good sense of constant forward progression. It's also just amusing in that old-school Newgrounds way of what if the Mario eats the mushroom and gets high instead of big? Or what if Barney the dinosaur ate kids and there was blood? Unfortunately, the grappling hook was super glitchy and awkward to use way back in January, so 0 out of 10. The thing about Palworld that I don't respect is what caused all of the supposed plagiarism controversy around it. I think that calling it plagiarism is mostly overblown, unless the model duplication allegations turned out to be true. I haven't kept up with that at all. But it is completely fair to call the game artistically lacking. Its visuals are very blatantly Pokemon with guns, and the environmental aesthetics are often ripped from Zelda Breath of the Wild. Not at all a new take, but many months on from the initial release and discourse, and this is still the game's legacy. An aesthetic identity that is a total lack of identity. Is the game out of early access now? Has anything been added to it? I don't know. My friends and I haven't played since that first month it came out and have not really looked back. The only bit of news I heard about it was Nintendo actually deciding to sue the developers. This entertaining, competently made game seems destined to be bound to its influences forever, never able to come into its own. I don't think I or my friends ever said the phrase Palsphere, we called them Pokeballs because of course we did. I value originality in art. I don't think it's possible to strive to make good art without a desire for some level of originality. That doesn't mean that I wish for a world where every creative is trying to be as avant-garde as possible, or that every artist needs to find a completely unique, never-before-done approach. Everything has already been done before, after all, and there's no shame in being honest about your inspirations. That's not incompatible with a desire for originality, it just means that there's a balance to be struck between imitation and contrarianism. Disco Elysium takes a lot of inspiration from Planescape Torment, but you would never call Disco a ripoff because so much work is done to craft a specific identity that now plenty of other games are trying to mimic. Palworld does mix its inspirations into a brew that hasn't been concocted before, to my knowledge, but it fails to disguise its inspirations in a way that does not make them distractingly obvious. Disco Elysium has many influences, but there is a Disco Elysium aesthetic. Palworld has many influences, and its aesthetic is just a list of them. And also Newgrounds. My stance on uniqueness and originality is that if a work of art doesn't have something to help it stand apart, then it will be overshadowed by its most obvious influences and will struggle to express any of its own ideas. Palworld is a fun game, and I'm glad I got to play it with friends. Its obvious aping of Pokemon is directly responsible for its initial financial success, but now that same facet will, I think, doom it to being little more than a footnote in Pokemon's gargantuan history. I was tempted to make a tongue-in-cheek video all about Palworld storytelling, doing in-depth narrative analysis on the fragments of writing scattered around the world map and in Pokédex entries. Part of this was meant as a redemptive quest to forge a real Palworld identity out of what the game does provide, and part of it was just meant as an elaborate joke because I wasn't expecting to find very much to dig into. But then everyone stopped caring about the game, and I haven't played it in almost a full year, so after this I doubt I'll think or talk about it ever again. I just wanted to bring it up because it was a big moment in gaming this year that I did experience, and also provides a nice bit of contrast to pretty much everything else I'm going to talk about. This is another game I played because my friends wanted to, another game that suddenly blew up into being the big thing for a little while, and another game that has incredibly obvious influences. For that reason, it's worth interrogating why I don't think Helldivers 2 is creatively lacking for taking so much from Starship Troopers, like I think Palworld is for taking from Pokemon and Breath of the Wild. Helldivers 2 takes the absurdist depiction of hypermilitarism featuring dehumanized, brainwashed soldiers being thrown against waves of bugs from Starship Troopers, especially the movie adaptation. However, the art design and lore details are distinct enough from that film, even though major elements are evocative. If you put a picture of a Helldiver next to a picture of a Starship Trooper, it's obvious which is which. You can't play the Pokemon or PAL game here. Well, I guess you maybe can with the bugs, but normally you're too busy blowing them up or running from them to spend much time evaluating their aesthetic influences. This is original enough for me. Like I said, I'm not demanding extravagant levels of uniqueness in every single instance. Maybe if the game was more of an in-depth narrative experience than a mission-based multiplayer one, I would need something more, but it's enough for what it is. My friends and I have come back to it sporadically throughout the whole year after initially picking it up. The game feels good to play in general, and the presence of the automatons are a great way to mix up the shape missions can take. I prefer fighting automatons, actually. I like how it's possible to use stealth against them, and overall there's a lot more ways to fight them than run away from a swarm and sometimes shoot back. There's something so entertainingly tense about trying to sneak around robot patrols in a stormy forest before getting caught and barely escaping. The bugs on higher difficulties are just annoying. The communal storytelling aspect of the game, where one of the devs sets war objectives and enemy movements in response to the actions of the collective player base, is super cool and something only a video game could do. Legends like the endless quagmire of Malevelon Creek can only happen organically through a design like this. I have mixed feelings about it long term because it's a great use of the medium, but by its nature, it is reliant on persistent support and interest from players. When the game inevitably loses its player base, the experience for anyone wanting to check it out retrospectively will be a lot worse. Game preservation is already so precarious, with corporate publishers adamant on deleting old games rather than letting anything be archived that they can't make money off of. So when there's a game like this that is almost by design unpreservable, I don't really know how to feel about it. We can enjoy it while it's here, I guess. I know there's been quite a lot of controversy around game balance and weapon nerfs, but frankly, I wasn't playing consistently enough to pay attention to any of that, so I don't have an opinion. My friends and I would just reduce the difficulty if things got too hard. That's not to say I don't think complaints about game balance could have been valid, it's just not something I can have an informed take on. I'm too much of a casual, I guess. Remember, this video is about games I played in 2024, not just games that came out in 2024. Anyway, Psychonauts 2, released in 2021, is an excellent game. I didn't mean to 100% it, but I did, and it didn't even take too long, once I used a guide to pick up the last few fragments. Psychonauts 2 is about 10-year-old circus child Raz having to navigate the mental problems of middle-aged and elderly psychics well beyond his own life experience in order to foil a secret plot to resurrect the infamous psychic supervillain Maligula. Raz's lack of understanding of adult problems gives the storytelling a lot of effective dramatic irony, but sometimes it also makes his presence comical or off-putting. The level focused on Bob Zanotto's alcoholism doesn't outright say the word alcoholism, and if Raz had heard it, he likely wouldn't have really known what it meant. But the level conveys the addiction well through the impression of the world design and level progression. Of course, Raz has always jumped into the minds of adults with problems he couldn't comprehend, but more of an effort has been made in 2 to take the mental issues seriously, even while still engaging in a lot of comedy. But sometimes Raz is very aware of certain things, and I was tempted to say that he can seem unreasonably beyond his years in these moments, but then I watched Taskmaster Jr., so never mind. The journeys into Ford Cruller's shattered psyche are great vignettes with impactful revelations about his relationship with Maligula, and each one has moments of just barely averting being explicit about certain things while still being clear enough to let you make the final interpretive leap yourself. In the hair level, there's that bit where you spill roach repellent on roaches and Ford cries about peaceful protesters being drowned. And it's incredibly obvious what happened, but there's just enough left unsaid to create a feeling of putting the pieces together yourself. It's nice that such sensation can be created, even for scenes so obvious like this. I doubt anyone would see them and not get what's being hinted at. The 3.5 Ford levels may be my favorite bits of storytelling in the game. I've heard some criticism of the reduction of the first game's zaniness in favor of more emotional storytelling focused on old people that's more sensitive about mental health. Perhaps this would feel less jarring if Psychonauts 2 didn't take place literally days after 1, despite taking 16 real years to come out. If Raz had grown up a little, the maturing of the storytelling overall would feel more in line with the maturing of Raz himself. However, that could take away the restraint in the conveyance of tragic backstories. If Raz had a better frame of reference for what he was seeing and could actually opine on everything, then the player would have less agency in interpretation. That is a perfectly fine way to tell a story too, but I'm glad we got what we did, and the game's balancing of humor and drama was effective for me. For whatever reason, whenever I explore the Motherlode Quarry, I can actually smell the stale Disneyland water from the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. Does anyone else have that? Hi-Fi Rush has had quite the saga. It was surprise released with no advertising and became instantly beloved, a shining gem of games made out of passion and artistry and fun even within a bigger publisher, to the point that Microsoft explicitly named it as representing the kind of game they wanted more of. Then they shut down Tango Gameworks because the game industry is plagued by every single bad quality capitalism has, and a modest success is not good enough. Then Krafton bought Tango to bring it and Hi-Fi Rush back from the dead. And what a fitting game to have such a resurrection. The storytelling is not subtle or sophisticated, but it is clear and charismatic. It's perfect action genre storytelling. It's about scrappy underdogs fighting to assert their individuality, independence, and value against a tyrannical corporation. The group of heroes consists of an unvalued outcast and former members of the corporation who have become disillusioned by its abusive practices. The anti-capitalist credentials of the narrative are undermined by the ultimate resolution being, vague spoilers, replacing the bad CEO with a good CEO rather than dissolving the all-dominating megacorp. But amusingly, that too reflects what happened in reality. I'm saying Krafton is the good corporation in this analogy, but I'm sure it's got some closet skeletons, I just don't know about them. Everything about Hi-Fi Rush's style is awesome. I love Edgar Wright movies, and they directly inspired the game, matching everything to the beat of the soundtrack. Timing hits to the beat is always satisfying once you get the hang of how to do it. The comic book art style is cool, and the character designs are all nicely distinct. The dialogue is often what I describe as quippy done right, at a time when that kind of banter is facing increasing backlash due to oversaturation. Perhaps the distinction here is that the characters are mostly taking the stakes of their struggle seriously. They're bickering with each other but still invested in what's going on around them. Take this moment when Chai faces the suspiciously wealthy furry in his billion-dollar fursuit.
Corsica? That wolf thing? Was not an expression!
I could very easily imagine this line in a Marvel film. Disclaimer, I'm not super burnt out on this kind of writing anyway, partly because I haven't forced myself to watch every major blockbuster in the last decade like some kind of masochist. The only MCU thing I've watched in the last 2.5 years was Agatha All Along, which was awesome, actually. But even so, I could see how the same line in the same situation with a more sarcastic delivery could come across as more irritating. If it was some smarmier, Tony Stark-esque, I guess that wolf thing wasn't an expression, huh, rather than Tchia's burst of panic. Jarvis, make me my own fursuit. There are still a number of moments that skirt up to feeling too clumsily bathos-y, like this bit.
Mr. Chai, was it? That's Mr. Chai to you.
That's what I just called you.
But I think the follow-up line with Chai's incredibly earnest,
Okay then!
saves the exchange because this part of the joke isn't so overdone. Other jokes just don't land, but go by quickly. Of course, this is all super subjective. Regardless, the writing is not super deep, but still highly charming throughout. The boss fights are fantastic with expertly used licensed music. Hope we can still hear them in 15 years. And the 10th level especially is a blast all the way through. I love every single silly monologue from the Seb robot. Microsoft was right when they said that this is the kind of game they need more of. Hope they don't try to murder the team that makes the next one. So here's a fun trick if you want to find cool indie games to play. When GDC rolls around every year, check out the Independent Games Festival. That's the awards show they do for indies before their main awards show for bigger players, and it showcases so many creative and innovative games in its nominee list. In 2024, their Excellence in Narrative Award went to this game, Mediterranea Inferno. I happen to think another nominee was better, and we'll get to that, but this game is still fascinating and I'm glad I checked it out. Really, the important thing to do is look at all the nominees and honorable mentions to see what looks interesting to you personally, not just the winner. But anyway, set in the summer of 2022 in Italy, this game follows 3 friends who were popular regulars of their local gay nightclub scene reuniting for the first time after Italy's COVID lockdowns ended. They try to reconnect and reckon with how the lockdowns have affected their relationships with each other, their inner selves, and the world. I was wary of the game just for being an overt lockdown processing piece, since there are so many ways such a thing could feel trite or exhausting, but Mediterranea uses it really well. The 3 main characters are struggling with different personal issues that existed before quarantine but were hypercharged by Italy's particular brand of forced isolation. Claudio feels the weight of family legacy that he is materially unable to live up to and continue. Mita's unrequited feelings for Claudio have curdled and he has become a successful but empty fashion influencer on social media, and the compulsive socializer Andrea has had a brutal time cooped up at home. All 3 of them lack internal validation in different ways, and as the game goes on, it's clear that none of them are able to comfort or support each other. Their psyches are explored through metaphor-infused vision quests called mirages, with the player choosing which of the 3 friends get to have mirages at particular junctures. The 3 protagonists are pitted against each other by the apparent master of the mirages, Madama, who says that if any one of them sees 4 mirages, he can reach heaven and have a better life, but only one of them can do so. It's up to the player who gets the mirages at specific times where you have to choose whose vacation whims to indulge, and therefore who wins this little contest to enlightenment. Aside from that, the only gameplay is finding and interacting with elements of these visions. So the game is a visual novel featuring artistic tableaus of the 3 main characters' issues, and these tableaus are generally fascinating expressions and explorations of their neuroses. My favorite moment comes from the very first mirage in the game.
Once upon a time, there was a man who received some miraculous blocks from God. He decided to build a tower to praise the Lord. God blessed him with happiness, and boom, with a child. To entertain the bored kid, the man decided to make a game. Let's see how many blocks you can remove from the tower, but don't let it fall. The child started removing blocks from the tower, and one after the other did it for many years. He grew up. One day he met a woman, and a few months later they got married. The old man invited the woman to their game, but she declined. Just watching him play is enough. Not long after, they had a baby, the first grandchild. He was smart, but according to his father, too young to play. Unfortunately, a pandemic killed the old man, leaving the child without a grandpa. The father kept playing the game, even if he didn't have fun at all. Only when the tower seemed too precarious for another move did he stop. That's when he finally said to his son, "It's your turn now. Come on, have fun." But the tower was too unstable, and the only thing the child could do was stare at the swinging structure.
Now, within the game, that Jenga metaphor applies very literally to Claudio's situation in a way that, when you realize it, may take away its effectiveness. Also, the rest of the game makes it clear, by which I mean explicitly says, that Claudio's response to this plight is rather fascistic. But thinking more broadly about this moment on its own, I found this Jenga tower a deeply meaningful analogy for the feeling of being a zillennial living through the 21st century, facing the algorithm-induced erosion of culture, older generations pulling the ladder up behind them in the incoming climate catastrophe. It stuck with me ever since I played. The game's strengths lie in these moments of targeted metaphor, in the unique ways it approaches otherwise quite well-trodden social commentary through its complex characters. Mita's pool mirage takes the very trite observation that social media is shallow and phone bad and presents it in an affecting and personal way that breathes new life into the message. Claudio, Andrea, and Mita are good characters, and the way the game gradually peels away the layers of their friendship to reveal the max of toxicity at its heart is tragic. It's a character study of three portraits of desperation, showing ways of responding to isolation and alienation. However, I don't think the game sticks the landing. I won't spoil, go play it for yourself and see how you feel, but to talk around my problem with it, I think the ways the characters who do not achieve heaven react to their loss kind of shoves them all out of their previously strong characterizations. And the secret ending didn't pack the punch it was meant to, at least for me. Regardless, Mediterranea Inferno is a really interesting visual novel that looks at contemporary issues in a refreshing manner that doesn't just feel like I'm being reminded of old news, which is a remarkable achievement for something so unashamedly topical. I'm a big fan of immersive sim stealth games like Dishonored and Deus Ex, but I haven't ever played a stealth tactics game before with an isometric perspective and multiple characters you can control as a team to methodically set up maneuvers around the map. Maybe Weird West was a bit of a borderline example, but Shadow Gambit: The Cursed Crew still feels like a version of stealth I'm not as well versed in. Fans of the subgenre have said that this game is a bit too easy, but since this is my first, it seemed fine to me. In a semi-alternate history island chain called the Lost Caribbean, an up-and-coming pirate named Afia Manicato decides to join the crew of the magically sapient pirate ship the Red Marley. Afia revives the titular cursed crew as they look for the fabled treasure of the Marley's deceased captain, while the villainous theocratic group called the Inquisition hounds them because they want the treasure too. The 8 playable characters all have fun and interesting abilities and cool synergies to discover. They've got neat character hooks, but unfortunately those hooks are most of the characterization they get. Tchia of Iga is a ninja who is a cook, so 90% of his dialogue is about combat as cooking or cooking as combat. Salady is a plant woman who is the ship doctor, so most of her lines are about plants or science experimentation. There are moments where the characters get a bit more, especially in their mirror test missions, but they still feel more like fun cartoons than fleshed out people. Overall, the storytelling is decent, it's functional. It works just fine and has a few elevated moments, but it's nothing special. The most interesting thing narratively is that the game writes save scumming into the story. The pirate ship the crew travels on, the Red Marley, is possessed by a time spirit who acts analogously to a ship-controlling AI in a sci-fi story. The Marley has in-universe powers of quick saving and quick loading, which the crew uses to undo mistakes during their missions and which the villain wishes to take over and hijack. However, the ultimate theme of the game is quite clearly you cannot go back and be stuck in the past, you have to move forward. The former captain of the Marley has set up a whole treasure hunt to convince the Marley and his crew to put the past behind them and move on from his death. So what exactly is the game saying when the missions require save scumming to save the day, to the point that the climax of the game would be impossible without it, but the moral is about learning to move on instead of trying to go back? Well, were I to try to reconcile this discrepancy, perhaps the game is saying that restarting to solve immediate problems is fine because because if at first you don't succeed, try and try again and whatnot. But in the long term, once the event is over, it's done, and there's no point trying to go back. This is reinforced by the fact that you can't load to older saves and redo story cutscenes on the ship. In the post-game, you can replay old missions for the sake of challenge completion, so maybe that undermines what I just said, but it's made clear that replaying the missions doesn't actually change the past. It's a bit messy, and it's often worthwhile to take such messiness as a sign to probe deeper rather than just dismiss it as bad writing. But given the one-note characterizations, maybe that would be a waste of time. Shadow Gambit shines in its gameplay, in setting up interesting levels and enemy placements around objectives and giving you total freedom of approach within your character's abilities. While the titular cursed crew is powerful, you can't really leap in and wipe out a fortress in open combat like you can in Dishonored. Time to kill is long, so getting spotted and raising an alarm and trying to actually fight will get you swarmed quickly. So while it is easy to pick off guards and clear an area if you're patient, it's not a total power fantasy. Just mostly one. Slowly infiltrating and clearing out an entire fortress is satisfying. Some of the post-game challenge badges are interesting too, though I ended up quitting before getting too far into those because the story was over and I lost interest. Maybe that's a mark against that aspect. But overall, the game is cool and fun. It doesn't seem to excel at any of what it's doing, but it is well beyond just competent. Though, is it just me, or does Quentin sound a lot like Chimbley Sweep from Unknown Person's Law of Talos animations?
Hey John, have you cleaned your anchor recently? I think I spy a couple of engravings I missed before.
Bugger if I'll stay here just to get troubled by some...
I'm the only one who knows what I'm even talking about, aren't I? My internet poison runs deep. I have a personal policy not to play games in early access. Hades 2 is sitting in my Steam library, uninstalled and unplayed for this very reason, but I accidentally played Shadows of Doubt for 60 hours before it officially released. Oops. This game is an incredible open-ended immersive sim. You have a lot of freedom to mess with the world to solve crimes, or just as likely, commit them, while in the process of solving others. The vibes are immaculate, as I think the kids may have said at one point. The game has a sort of Batman the Animated Series approach to anachronistic noir design, with general 1930s through 50s designs, but also 80s computers and cyber enhancements straight out of Deus Ex. Shadows of Doubt goes further by being full-on alternate history, where the Industrial Revolution happened earlier in France and the entire course of global history was reshaped. The details are mostly not spelled out in the game itself, but are well conceived and add so much texture to the world if you notice them. The devs have spoken about how the script for the in-game noir movie you can catch snippets of on TV, Claw of the Fathoms, a Decca Gill story, took care to make sure that slang was retro in its tone, but actually lore-specific, which is an admirable level of attention to detail. When you're in the middle of a murder case, the process of solving it can be so absorbing because of how open-ended your options are, and how differently the variables of evidence, method of killing, and connection to the victim can be. The first time I ever saw notes around the victim's apartment indicating they were a victim of stalking, the killer turned out to be the building manager who had left a note I found dismissing the victim's concerns about being followed around. That kind of note is programmed to happen even if the building manager is innocent, but the fact that the first time I saw it happened to turn out the way it did was such a gut punch. Sometimes the procedural storytelling gives funny results instead. One time it seemed a case had gone cold when suddenly I ran into a pedestrian on the street who matched the suspect description I had. So I asked for her fingerprints and she happily complied, and it turned out she was the killer. Real Gavrilo Princip moment there, or I guess a reverse Princip. Another time I took a side job to investigate infidelity and discovered that my client was also cheating, but I guess it was okay when she did it. Shadows of Doubt has the best quality of any procedural game, the frequency of organic, unscripted, entertaining anecdotes like these. Of course, as has commonly been criticized, once you get into a routine and figure out how effective certain tricks can be, the game can become repetitive and mundane. This isn't helped by the complete uniformity of the dialogue with the procedurally generated citizens. They all have stock dialogue that breaks immersion with its obvious reuse and shallowness. Theoretically, this is something that generative language models could fix, but ew, gross, no, never. I'd rather have the janky charm of what's in the game now than LLM sludge that would all end up being samey anyway. It would be nice to have more dialogue for the partners and co-workers of victims and murderers at least, just to give an extra layer of reactivity and immersion. I know there's been backlash over the game leaving early access without some dialogue overhaul and other major additions. I absolutely get it, but I'm not mad. It's still a good game. I find Shadows of Doubt is best played in quick bursts every now and then before leaving it for a while. Jump in, solve a few cases, then get out before the routine gets too boring. Then a few months later, pick it up and do it all again.
Bon voyage!
I play RPGs for the narrative experience. Good role-playing and character-building mechanics are important and missed when they're gone, but a good narrative can make up for a lot. Space Wreck is a bit of an odd duck because the role-playing and character-building mechanics are exceptional, but the actual narrative is just serviceable. It's a highly reactive series of scenarios for the player character that allow for many different approaches so that most types of build can make it through in their own ways. A diplomat may not be able to fix up a broken ship part with duct tape, but they can convince someone else to part ways with a replacement, that sort of thing. The actual narrative is just, you're the new captain of a ship, you have to leave to scavenge for a part to fix your engine, and here are places you can go to on your search with their own hyper-local situations going on. NPC interactions are almost entirely objective-oriented, which means there aren't many opportunities for characterization. You flit in and out of people's lives, and they only briefly appear in yours. There are a few who have a bit more going on. My favorite part of the game from a narrative standpoint is the ship that's been stranded and its crew has managed to eke out a living on board even as the population is aging out of being able to work and their infrastructure is failing. There's discontentment on the ship and different ideas of how to move forward, while you, as the outsider, have to rely on the help of whoever you can convince. Depending on your build, you may not be able to get help from someone you most want to help you. Considering the short length of a single run, this is absolutely a game worth playing more than once. Background lore is clear and functional and sufficient. Humanity has colonized the stars, and corporate abuses of power have come along for the ride, resulting in an armed rebellion from a bunch of mining workers that has caused a lot of chaos and little in the way of progress. So everybody you come across in the series of wrecks and derelict vessels you encounter is miserable in some way. There's some poignancy you can dig into if you look at how the space wrecks in Space Wreck represent the detritus of those harmed and discarded in grander conflicts. But the generally uninteresting moment-to-moment stories leave me struggling to think of more to say than this. One complaint I have for the actual quest design is that while it's cool you can complete certain quest objectives out of order, the game doesn't always account for this. So for the society in the derelict ship I mentioned before, I ended up running into the captain by accident and talking to him, and used the speech checks available to me to resolve the main area's quest without knowing what I was even doing, and then afterwards I found the person who was supposed to give me the quest I just finished, and they acted like I hadn't yet. So there's some lack of accounting for accidental sequence breaking, which is a problem for a game that actively encourages freedom of approach. If I had to describe the game in a short, pithy review tagline, I'd say it's a mediocre story told well, or a well-crafted and reactive adventure with uninteresting framing. It's fun because of how you navigate through it, but in a year I doubt I'll remember much about the actual story. I consider this a drawback for an RPG, but for those who don't mind if a story is just serviceable and want some dense and rewarding RPG mechanics, this is definitely worth a try. Sanabi is one of the newer installments of the spiritual series I like to call pixel art cyberpunk indie games with synthwave soundtracks about the dehumanizing nature of violence. I'm not great with names. Sanabi is pretty fun, though that one boss fight against the combat aircraft was incredibly annoying. Sanabi is much heavier on cutscenes than I was expecting, and luckily the writing is pretty good. It's a jaded dad opens up after traveling with a surrogate child story, which we've seen a whole lot of in the last decade in works like Last of Us and at least half the Disney Plus Star Wars shows. In the pixel art cyberpunk future, a robot-armed expert soldier known as the General has had his peaceful retirement with his daughter interrupted by a daughter-removing bomb, and is now on a quest for vengeance. He travels to Mago City, ruled by the Mago Corporation, to investigate strange occurrences that he suspects are tied to the bombers, and meets the cheery hacker Mari, whom he begins to bond with as a surrogate daughter of sorts. The flashback sequences with the General and his small child are so painfully cliché that you think this has to be fake. There's something so suspicious about these scenes. And that instinct is kind of right, kind of not. A lot of the hyper-saccharine moments are real, but there is still something strange going on, and the plot goes to some much more interesting places than might first appear. I think it could have gotten to the interesting stuff a little quicker, but that's not a huge issue. Sanabi manages the admirable feat of writing the surrogate daughter character as running right up to the thin line between endearingly chatty and very annoying, and almost never actually crossing it. For a while there, I was expecting a very obvious plot twist, and it turned out to be true, but also a distraction for the real plot twist. It was one of those circumstances where the most important reveals were hidden by making a really obvious one to soak up all the attention, and it was quite effective. The General's grappling hook arm gets a lot of mileage in the gameplay as you ascend from the city's ditches to heights above the clouds. The various combat zones are typically pretty easy to get through. The boss fights are more challenging, and aside from the annoying one with the aircraft, are pretty good, especially the final boss, which you won't realize is the final boss because there's a platforming gauntlet afterwards, but anyway. Play Sanabi if you like side-scrolling action platformers and dad quest stories. It's good. This is a game about an Austrian town where magic and fantasy creatures suddenly appeared and turned the place into a vacation destination for tourists to go dungeon dive and fight monsters. What an odd concept. I dig it. The main character is a lawyer from Vienna named Louisa who's burnt out on her job and has come to unwind by bashing goopy folklore-resembling creatures in the face. And she gets wrapped up in local politics about the slaycation industry. I find the deeply ambivalent stance the game takes towards tourism intriguing. It's clear that the commercialized slaying industry has resulted in a huge economic boom for the town of Hinterberg, and Louisa regularly muses on how incredible the vacation has been for her personal well-being. It has directly led to greater self-discovery for her, which is true for many of the side characters you can get to know as well. However, other characters lament the lack of proper respect for the presence of magic in the town, with tourists treating it as just an amusement. We also see the hollowing out of local businesses, the regular abuses of service staff, and especially the negative environmental impact. It's not just the game saying vacations are good or vacations are bad, it's the somewhat more nuanced, vacations are great for the soul but the industry around them is often toxic. Things get a bit more simplistic by the end, but play for yourself and see if you agree. The actual gameplay loop is a very regimented daily routine. Wake up, occasionally have a scripted conversation with someone, then go out into one of the exploration zones and look for a dungeon or a rest spot to spend the day. Do the dungeons or just rest at the rest spot for stat bumps. Then go into town, shop for new gear if you want, and find a side character to hang out with or just watch a movie if you're feeling like an introvert. Then decide whether to get a good night's sleep or stay up late reading or watching TV, and then repeat. The dungeon gameplay is decent. Combat is no Bayonetta or Hi-Fi Rush, but it's still fun. I know that dungeon diving takes inspiration from Legend of Zelda, and the only one of those I've actually played is Twilight Princess, but I'd say Dungeons of Hinterberg's combat surpasses that particular Zelda's. The puzzles are perhaps on the easier side of the sweet spot of needing to use your brain a little but never taking too long. The snowboard power is awesome. My biggest problem with the game is that the daily routine ends up making things too stretched out by the end. Because this is explicitly a vacation, I would expect to have a limited number of days, but you don't. You can spend as many days as you want, even when certain plot elements indicate that finishing all the dungeons is a more urgent priority. I didn't register the line of dialogue where Louisa officially decides that she's quitting her lawyer job. I don't know when this happens, but even so, I'd assume there would be other pressures on her to leave. I wanted to finish all the side stories of the side characters, but you can only advance one per day, so my playthrough lasted over 2 months of in-game time. I guess that's European holidays for you. Catch up, America. But the later stages of the side character stories compound the strangeness of how long it's taking, when the final couple characters I had left went through small arcs in a few days that were clearly written to take place over weeks. In other words, the game suffers a common flaw in open-ended narratives where players can advance things at their own pace. There is clearly an optimal order for how to experience the stories, but you're allowed to deviate from that in a way that scripted scenes can't account for. Additionally, those last few days were just me doing nothing during adventuring time because I was holding off on the final dungeon, had seen all the rest spots, and already maxed out my gear, but still needed to get through 3 or 4 relationship stories. I'd like it better if you could hang out with people in the morning too. Right now it feels almost like a waste of a time of day. But New Game Plus exists now, which means that the best way to experience the game is likely to not worry about maxing out everyone's relationships, play through the game immersed in the urgency of later plot beats, and then have your New Game Plus playthrough be the one where you clean up all the side stories that you missed. Tchia is a game about New Caledonia. It says so right on the title screen. I knew nothing about New Caledonia before trying this out. Did you know that this Pacific island near Australia is still a French-controlled territory and its citizens can vote in French elections? The world of Tchia is not literally New Caledonia. It includes some direct landmark recreations, but is otherwise a constructed analogy of the archipelago that draws heavily from the culture of its indigenous people. This is a fantasy setting, with magic and godlike entities and fictional cities and towns, but a fully modern level of societal development. Fashion is modern, there's a city, factories, the wreck of a cargo freighter, and stuff like that. It's cool to see this kind of fantasy world with a modern society that isn't just literally Earth with a secret wizard world or whatever, or a sudden incursion of magic into modern Earth like Dungeons of Hinterberg. It comes as a direct result, I think, of the game's desire to celebrate its developer's homeland in its contemporary entirety, with its populations of French and indigenous people side by side. Sure, we do see tension between a town of mostly white French speakers and a more traditional indigenous tribe, but no overt conflict. Certainly not in the face of the evil god who our titular protagonist fights against. The villain is of the mythic, of the part of the lore inspired by native culture, and in-universe, it is a local god. This is not a story about a struggle against some outside colonialism. If there is an equivalent to France as a faraway governing power in this world, it's never mentioned. You play as a young girl named Tchia, who's been living on a tiny self-sufficient island with her dad until some guy shows up in a helicopter to kidnap him. Tchia discovers that she has weird magic powers and embarks on a quest across her archipelago to find her father. The gameplay comes directly from the Breath of the Wild model of running and climbing around an open world with a glider and stamina meter. The unique gameplay element is Tchia's ability to possess both animals and inanimate objects in the world around her. It's surprisingly fun to jump into a bird and fly around for a bit, or to jump into a rock, launch the rock into the air, and jump back into it and keep slingshot chaining yourself across the map. The two main islands provide a nice contrast with each other, featuring verdant forests to the north, and more desolate dirt around the factories on the industrialized southern island. The northern island is friendlier overall, with multiple small settlements and fun low-stakes challenges, while the southern island has one big city and then several hostile enemy camps, and a few big factories to infiltrate and take down like the eco-terrorist 10-year-old Tchia is. Exploration really is the central mechanic of the game. Despite the story going to some suddenly dark places near the end, venturing over mountains or swimming around coral reefs has a buoyant, uplifting feel to it. There's a lot of cool landmarks to find, as well as an impressively varied suite of clothing options for Tchia. There are traditional clothes, but you can also dress up as a cowboy or a pirate or a radical biker. Also, there's a magic ukulele you can play. The actual story is nothing special, but it maintains a charming fairy tale simplicity to it. And I mean fairy tale in the old school sense. Like I said, things get dark. There is a bit of divine right of kings stuff in it, which is a pet peeve trope of mine in fantasy, but everything is elevated by the developer's commitment to New Caledonia's culture and the sheer joy on display as you explore. I've briefly touched on this in a previous video, but this game is a real achievement as a proper open-world game made by a small indie studio. It's not as blockbuster as a GTA or an Assassin's Creed, but it's still impressive. I quite liked Gunpoint and Heat Signature, and Tactical Breach Wizards may be Tom Francis's best game yet. You play as a group of Spec Ops wizards in yet another modern fantasy fictional world, and unravel a plot by a private military company to effectively take over the world. While Tchia features the mythic as this greater force beyond human creation, Tactical Breach Wizards simply treats it as another mundane part of the world that modern society has harnessed. Theoretically, the same plot beats would work for a Call of Duty game if the magic was just replaced with guns and nukes. But that would also sacrifice so much of the game's charm. Also, in COD, you'd be working for the military instead of being an independent team of people trying to do the right thing. Gameplay strikes an excellent balance between strict puzzle solutions and the ability to improvise in a pickle, at least most of the time. Some of the optional confidence challenges can get a bit narrow in terms of how they can be passed, but they are at least satisfying to solve. The 5 playable characters are all distinct in aesthetics, gameplay, and personality, other than the fact that Jen and Zan talk kind of similarly, and there are plenty of cool ways to synergize their abilities. The basic game loop is that you get a room of enemies with different strengths and weaknesses, and you use turn-based combat to take out all the enemies with these squad mates at your disposal. You can endlessly reset all the moves you make in a single turn, but once you end the turn, you're locked into whatever you've just done, unless you restart the whole level. It's highly addicting, which Francis's games have always been, but this went to a new level. The fact that each squad member plays completely differently means that there's so many ways to approach levels, especially on replays when you can choose who to bring on each mission. Like with Hi-Fi Rush, the dialogue is quippy in a good way, though even more leaning in the irreverent direction. Unlike Hi-Fi Rush, this game isn't voiced, and I think lack of voice acting can be highly underrated for allowing a reader to interpret their own delivery of certain lines that could come across as more annoying if given a particular performance. Tom Francis dialogue very much uses the blabbermouth kind of quipping, as well as the comedically overly insightful kind that pops up a lot in stuff like BoJack Horseman. The effectiveness of such quips can be heavily dependent on delivery, but if you don't have delivery and it's up to the player to read it in their head, then there's no bad delivery. The plot of Tactical Breach Wizard starts off simply as these 2 characters are trying to stop a rogue Spec Ops agent from doing something shady for a PMC, and by sticking to that simple focus the whole way through, it's easy to keep track of the escalating political plot. Maybe because Heat Signature is a story-sparse roguelike, I forgot how good Gunpoint's narrative was, but I shouldn't have been surprised that Tactical Breach Wizards is also well written. Using dreams as ways to explore the psyches of the 5 main characters is a well-known shortcut to character depth. But when it works, and it works here. It helps that each of these anxiety dreams takes a different creative approach, with variation in what it means for each character to speak to themselves in these situations. Lastly, the final boss is one of the best final bosses in recent memory. It's just a perfect test of every skill you've developed for every main character. In terms of raw fun, Tactical Breach Wizards may be my favorite game I'm discussing, with strong storytelling as a bonus. But there are some games I played with even better stories, even if their gameplay is sparser. This is a love story. That's what you see as the game boots up, and there's no better primer for what it's about. Perhaps it may have led me to hyper-focus my interpretation on how everything about it relates to love, when there are other, more existentialist themes I don't have many thoughts about. And yet, could you blame me? If you've played Slay the Princess, surely you'd agree. This is a love story. It is about love in its complicated totality, in all its horror and wonder and pain and forgiveness and endless paradox. Love is such a vast, complicated emotion and experience, but now, if I'm ever, for some reason, asked to explain what love is, I have a simple answer. Just play Slay the Princess. If you've only experienced the more horror-focused parts of this game, or the parts that feature the toxic elements of love, then you may be horrified at this suggestion, but again, this game is about love. All of love, in its totality, it's good and bad. You have to take the heartwarming with the nightmarish for the full picture. Love is too vast to be simplified. I'm glad I waited until the Pristine cut to play it, because getting to experience the new stuff in uninterrupted context with everything else was great. The happily ever after ending was so good. I don't blame the game's writer for thinking it's the best thing he ever wrote, even though I've never seen his other work. I want to dedicate more time to Slay the Princess in the context of another video where I will get into spoilers and discuss how this game puts new spins on ideas from Disco Elysium. And this game is really tough to talk about without spoiling because it's really best experienced in the dark, at least for a first playthrough. For now, I'll just say that this is a wonderful experience of love and perception and so much more filtered through that, with the most reactive use of the RenP visual novel game engine since Road Warden. And I'd be remiss remiss not to mention how excellent the performances of Jonathan Sims and Nicole Goodnight are, even if that's not anywhere close to a new observation. I don't mind games that lack voice acting and understand the budgetary limitations of having full VO, but for a game like this, a Ren'Py visual novel with really only 3 characters, hiring 2 actors to record the whole thing is sensible and elevates the already stellar writing. It's funny, heartwarming, heartbreaking, frightening, it's just lovely. Unless you don't like visual novels at all, then I guess I don't know what to say. In Stars and Time is a masterpiece, and maybe my new favorite time loop story. Slay the Princess is technically a time loop story, but also not, and either way, it's not really about its version of a time loop. Outer Wilds is still a top contender, but there the loop is more of a device to build intrigue for a mystery and enable rampant trial and error. In terms of narratives where the psychological and thematic impacts of the loop are the focus, In Stars and Time explores the concept in such a fascinating and resonant way. It's not like delving into the mental toll of time loops is some new approach to the genre. It's always been part of stories like Groundhog Day. In that film, the loop can be read as a metaphor for being stuck in a personal rut before growing out of it and being able to proceed with your life. In Stars and Time is similar, but here the loop serves as a reflection of the antagonist's wish to freeze his perfect world in place. The game's exploration of the pathology of clinging to a single moment in time is something I found incredibly meaningful. You play as Siffrin, the lovable rogue sidekick in a JRPG-esque adventuring party right at the end of their globe-trotting adventure. The player has basically skipped the majority of a standard JRPG and jumped right to the end, because this is not about the journey, it's about what happens when the destination is finally in sight. The adventuring party goes into that final dungeon, Siffrin dies immediately, and the time loop starts. Things get worse from there. The gameplay is fine with a literal rock-paper-scissors elemental system that is satisfying to break over your knee once you're powerful enough, but it's the narrative that elevates In Stars and Time to excellence. The world-building of Valgard is impressive, with cultural values focused around celebrating change that influences the people who grew up there in intriguing ways. Meanwhile, the characters who come from elsewhere have their own views on Valgardian culture. Every single character is so likable and layered, with Siffrin in particular being one of my favorite video game protagonists of all time. His personality of introverted comic relief is a charming hook to get you invested, and the depth that emerges over time is upsettingly relatable, at least to me. I also like that they technically aren't the hero going by archetypal JRPG party roles, since Mirabelle is the actual chosen one, just to play with the format a bit, though that's also been done before, like with Final Fantasy X. Siffrin's slowly worsening mental state has many scenes dedicated to it that are so good at instilling a feeling of dread as it becomes clear how much he's actively getting worse. The ways meaningful scenes change when they're repeated feel like the Groundhog Day snowman scene on steroids. The tragic impermanence hangs over meaningful moments of bonding the first time, and when you see them again, it's even worse because it's no longer genuine from Siffrin's side. Ingeniously, the most powerful of such scenes are tied to strong upgrades for each companion, which directly incentivizes you to see these diminished versions of the scenes to be hit with the full emptiness of their repetitions. Though, on the other hand, it's unlikely you'll need them by the endgame because Siffrin retains experience and skills throughout all the loops, so fights won't be too hard. There's a lot of good quality of life features in general to make repeating the entire dungeon less tedious, especially because at a certain point advancing the plot requires you to restart to look for a single specific book or clue and then restart again. The ability to warp back and forward as necessary, as well as unlock the ability to scare away random encounters, is a huge relief. I already praised Siffrin, and all the other characters are also expertly crafted. I mentioned Mirabelle in the context of her role as the RPG hero, but her neurotic, caring, and second-guessing personality is a lot more interesting than the more generic hero archetype she easily could have been. Isabeau's kindness is of a different flavor, a more playful and teasing kind of genuineness, and his pun-based banter with Siffrin makes both more endearing because of how much smug fun they have with it. As adult Valgardians, Mirabelle and Isabeau have their own perspectives on what's going on in their country. Meanwhile, Odile's more analytical perspective as a foreigner and the responsible adult of the group adds a lot, especially in contrast to literal child Bonnie, one of the most well-realized child characters I can think of. The King is a great antagonist, and Loop is a delight. If I had one narrative complaint, it would be that while the last major reveal of the game recontextualizes the relevant character in a great way, it also invites a couple nitpicks and misinterpretations about how the time loop works that might distract from the full impact. Really a minor quibble, and since this reveal is actually possible to miss, some players may not even see it if they don't know it's there. Like me at first. Oops. Like I said, In Stars and Time is a masterpiece. It was my favorite narrative experience in 2024. It was. Until I played... I'm sorry, Insert Disc 5, the developer of In Stars and Time, if you happen to come across this video. No shame in second place when first place is... this. I first heard about 1000 Times Resist when I went to check those GDC Indie Awards back in March. That's right, I knew about it before Jacob Geller talked about it, aren't I cool? And the game seemed interesting, but for whatever reason it was nominated in this award show before it had even come out. I don't know how this happened, and it made me suspicious that there was some sort of weird astroturfing thing going on there, so I unwishlisted it. But then it came out, and because of my previous interest, I checked out the start of Short One Gaming's playthrough, and I quickly stopped watching and re-wishlisted it, and bought it not long after and played it non-stop for a weekend. I'm glad I didn't write it off for whatever weirdness there was with the IGF nominations, because this game is so good. It tells the story of a society of clones living in a secluded facility because the world has been ravaged by otherworldly beings called occupants. One of these clones, Watcher, is tasked with diving into the memories of the woman everyone is cloned from, Iris, immortal and immune from the disease the occupants bring. She is the All-Mother. There is immediate juxtaposition between the reverence the clones, the sisters, show their All-Mother, and the terrible teenage brattiness we see from Iris as Watcher explores a time when high school still existed, when there was more than one face. Things get crazier from there. We also see the greatest rap ever made by humankind.
Stupid kids have to study. Smart kids get to go home.
Don't say that. People learn differently. What are you doing?
Doing my time in a pressed white collar. I was sipping my juice from a box when I saw her. She walks in clean, a straw in a wrapper, no crime on record when she gave me a holler. Behind the bars of detention, paying no attention, no rap, no rhyme, just laying down a sentence. People learn different. Who am I to say no? The bad kids stay, the good kids go.
Each chapter has a slightly different primary method of storytelling. In the first chapter, you experience a fixed-camera third-person perspective as you swap between one of Iris's school days and a day many years later, after the apocalypse, when Iris returns with a contingent of soldiers to visit the school's ruins. Chapter 2 has you jumping between several short vignettes across Iris's adolescence from a first-person perspective within her family's humble apartment. Chapter 3 takes the form of a more detached, side-scrolling perspective with storybook-like narration. I won't spoil the rest, but Chapter 7 is my unambiguous highlight. In that school chapter, the game has to juggle the simultaneous humanization and deification of Iris, characterizing Watcher and her tiny robo-buddy secretary, building intrigue around what exactly happened in the post-apocalypse timeline, introducing Iris's relationship with Zhao that becomes central to the rest of her life, and providing a glimpse into Iris and Zhao's classmates and the soldiers accompanying post-apocalypse Iris, even though neither set of background characters will ever really be seen again. It pulls off all of this expertly, with one possible exception being Watcher's characterization. In a few moments, Watcher seems confused by things in the society of the past that still exist in the society the All-Mother built, like acting, but that's minor in the face of everything else. This game is about societal change, about being an immigrant and outsider, about survival, about belief and dogma, about how history is made and altered, but most importantly, it is about generational trauma. A long line of parents and children, especially mothers and daughters, passing on struggles and insecurities as the world ends around them. 1000 Times Resist is not just my favorite game of 2024, but maybe one of my favorite stories ever. I cried like a baby at camcorder footage of a road, and I teared up just thinking about it to write this. And again to record it. I have no illusions that this is a sentiment everyone will share, but it's how I feel. The gameplay is pretty sparse. It's mostly just walking around, talking to people, and occasionally solving a simple puzzle. Calling it a walking simulator is reductive because there are neat ways the game uses its interactivity that go beyond the stereotypes such a term brings to mind, but it's not a completely unfair label. So if you need in-depth gameplay to enjoy a game, then I guess you'll have to miss out. But if you are willing to play something more walking simulator-esque, and you value good narratives, and you only have the time or money for a single game in this video, choose this one. Heki Almo, everybody. These are all good games, and you should check out any of the ones you find interesting. Some grabbed me more than others, but each one had passion and heart put into them. Even Palworld features a good display of craft, even if its creative vision leaves a lot to be desired. It's important to remember that human beings poured their lives into these projects, and there's always something of value to dig into. So again, play whatever you find interesting. I'm going to get preachy now.
I am about to state my political beliefs.
I didn't realize you cared.
I want to briefly revisit some of the games that stuck with me the most this year, this time with focus on how the perspectives of their creators fed directly into the depth and artistic enrichment of their storytelling. 1000 Times Resist ties Iris's family history directly to the Hong Kong protests of 2019. And Iris's life as a student, a daughter, and then the All-Mother is all heavily influenced by her experience as the child of Hong Kong citizens who fled to Canada. Her dynamic with her parents, her less assimilated friend Zhao, the rest of her peers, and then her clones all carry the weight of this life context. The developers of 1000 Times Resist are themselves Asian Canadians with ties to Hong Kong, and their creation feels so personal, so elevated by their viewpoint. Their background in performance arts also directly inform the techniques they use to tell the story with minimal production value. In Stars in Time was developed by the mostly solo dev Insert Disc 5, also Canadian and also French, who has spoken about wanting the game's fantasy world to be specifically French-inspired rather than generically European or British. She's also within the LGBTQ sphere, and the way the changed religion of Valgard explores queer identity is incredibly well thought out and intriguing, because it's not just an LGBTQ utopia. Even though a culture built around change is very fluid about gender, it may not be so utopian for, say, an asexual person who feels that the changed religion's prioritization of new experiences is putting pressure on them to have sexual experiences. It's a thoughtful, considered concept from someone within the community. Tchia is, of course, a love letter to the creator's home of New Caledonia, with its modern and especially indigenous cultures on display together in full glory. This celebration elevates what could otherwise have felt like a fairly stock Breath of the Wild alike. Mediterranea Inferno is about 3 Italian gay party boys dealing with zillennial angst and COVID aftershocks, made by zillennial Italians who lived through COVID and some of whom are also, presumably, gay. Dungeons of Hinterberg tackles the complex issues around tourism with a specifically Austrian setting, and given that the developers are themselves Austrian, I'm sure they've seen a lot of the specific flaws and benefits of holiday that they portray. Slay the Princess is a story about the complex, multifaceted textures of love, crafted primarily by a married couple working as a team. This is a major reason why diversity matters to stories, in addition to the real people who create and experience them. Real diversity, behind the scenes too, not just on screen. These works of art are enriched by the perspectives on display, given texture beyond the baseline, bursting with earnestness and personal specificity. Someone born in America to a middle-class, suburban, English-descended Christian family still living in America could make a story about an immortal woman beheld as a goddess by a society of clones of herself. And it may very well be great on its own merits, but it couldn't be 1000 Times Resist. It's generally understood writing advice that it's good to be specific, and that perhaps counterintuitively, adding specificity makes a story or character more universally relatable. Maybe you don't personally care about 19th century fashion, but you know what it's like to have interests, so a character expressing deep passion about 19th century fashion is still acting in a recognizable way and can be endearing, and you can maybe learn a new thing while watching them. The perspective of a creator influences the specifics they would think to add to their work, work, and what specifics they could add with the most authenticity. Therefore, the more varied the perspectives within a pool of creators there are, the more varied the specifics instilled into the works there can be. A creator doesn't have to only tell stories directly about themselves, of course. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that the more diverse the perspectives are in our artistic landscape, the greater that landscape would become. The limited opportunity, tentpole-focused model of major media conglomerates may, at times, make inclusion appear like a zero-sum game, like there's only a limited room for a set amount of perspectives. But this is a false perception fostered by monopolies, prioritizing potential mass-market mega-hits, over-reliance on brand recognition, and corporate cowardice. And also, of course, exaggerated by bad faith commentators with unsavory agendas. Disney wants to pour most of its money into a small amount of guaranteed hits that appeal to as many people as possible at once, which means that instead of expanding the playing field by making things more inclusive, some players are just getting substituted in and out, and their stories are sanded down for the sake of mass appeal. That's not a problem with the idea of diversity, it's a problem with our current model of corporate creation. Painting as an art form is better off for the existence of both Claude Monet and Kudzanai Violet Hwami. Diversity matters. Yes, it is possible for diversity to be handled clumsily, for inclusion to feel token, or for social commentary to be distractingly on the nose.
We're all very special people. Stop it!
It's common, actually. The Sturgeon's Law heuristic states that 90% of everything is crap, and there sure is a lot of everything competing for attention nowadays. But that means there's quite a lot in that remaining 10% too. If you ask me, getting 9, Dustborns for every 1 in Stars and Time is a price I am more than willing to pay. Besides, you can just ignore the Dustborns. Some art is bad art, and that's just how it is, even in a healthy creative ecosystem, which our current one very much isn't. Okay, I'm off the soapbox. For the rest of the video, I wanted to highlight the awesome games I played this year because I played a lot of good ones that are worth checking out. We live in a world where interests have fragmented, and as a result, what's made for the mainstream is practically forced to be grayer and sludgier than ever. That makes it all the more important to look for art that is able to break through with passion and excitement. Don't limit yourself to only eating the sludge and being outraged by its tastelessness. That's what the average YouTube media discusser appears to do, and it seems like a miserable life. I've got enough problems. I'd rather enjoy how I spend my free time, and I bet you would too. Sphere to Square. Hecky Grace.
We somehow made it through all of this. Making things is hard, things never go as planned. Too many features, not enough time. We want the best, but can only do so much with what we have. So this is what we made. We've never been more proud. A game, a song, a million different pieces working together. Brought to you